And it's a pleasure to welcome our guest for this afternoon, Professor Dov Waxman, who holds the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Israel Studies chair, and is the director of the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. Before joining UCLA, he was the director of the Northeastern University's Middle East Center. And Professor Waxman received his undergraduate degree at Oxford and his graduate degrees from the School for Advanced International Studies in Johns Hopkins. And he's internationally recognized scholar and expert on Israel, on Israeli identity, on diasporas, and is the author of 4 very important books that I recommend to all of you who have an interest in this. As you know, we normally go for between 60 and 90 minutes. We'll continue in that tradition. So far, all our sessions have actually gone to an hour and 15 to an hour and a half because of the questions and the intensity and the breadth and depth of the conversation, which I'm sure will be the case today as well. And leading our conversation is someone who I'm sure does not really need much of an introduction to many of you, Derek Penzler, who recently took on the status of Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto and is now a chair of Jewish history and professor of history at Harvard University. And through the magic of Zoom, it's almost as if he were next door back in Toronto. So with that, one last reminder that we do encourage you to provide some questions or your comments. Unless I'm instructed otherwise, I believe it's going to be in the Q&A, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. And with that, let me turn this over to Derek.
Hi, Dov. Are you there?
I am. Yes. Hi, Derek. Hi, nice to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So it's 9 in the morning, and what it's probably about 22 degrees and sunny and beautiful, right?
That's right. Yes, it's a very warm and another sunny day in California. Almost every day, it's like
right.
That. So coming from the UK, I could never take this for granted. Permanent sunshine.
No, you know, my daughter's living there now. She's getting married, actually. In a few weeks, we're going to be over in the UK briefly. So we're bringing lots of wax jackets and boots. So, well, let's stick with the Mediterranean today, or at least how Jews in the diaspora view a certain small country in the Eastern Mediterranean. And, you know, you've written so authoritatively and in such breadth and depth about diaspora-Israel relations. And particularly in your book, The Trouble in the Tribe, that came out because it was 5 years ago. Marvelous book, and I just cannot recommend it highly enough. If we can talk a little bit, just start at perhaps the issue that's on, I would hazard that of all the people who are listening, when you talk about diaspora-Israel relations, the first thing people are concerned about is generational change. That, you know, whenever I give a talk about Israel, I'm sure you hear this, there's a lot of anxiety from older Jews in diaspora, the United States, Canada in particular, in my experience, that they feel like their attachments to Israel are not being passed down to the next generation. And to what extent do you think this is true? If yes, why? If not, then what is going on and why are we thinking this way? I mean, it's a big question, but I thought it's a great way to get the conversation started.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you, Derek, and I want to thank Rabbi Goodman and Dr. Dewitt for inviting me to speak to you all. It's a pleasure to do so. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there is a great deal of anxiety about the next generation's relationship with Israel. I'd start off by noting that there's nothing new about this anxiety. I think, in fact, it's kind of a perennial feature of Jewish communities, at least since the establishment of Israel, is to kind of fret about whether the next generation is going to be as attached to Israel as they are, whether there's a decline in attachment. I mean, for decades now, actually, within the American Jewish community, there's been this anxiety, really, at least since the 1990s. There's, always panels and discussions worrying about our young American Jews, distancing themselves from Israel. So in some sense, I think this is a kind of evergreen conversation that will always happen. And it's really a subset of a much longer Jewish anxiety about where the next generation will be attached to Jewishness. In some ways, the conversation around Israel is a kind of stand-in for a broader conversation and a broader concern about whether the next generation will raise, Jewish children and whether the Jewish people will survive, essentially. And that's a kind of perpetual fear among diaspora Jews. I think in terms of, whether this fear is well-founded, yes, the survey data shows that young Jews, young American Jews at least, do have less of an attachment to Israel than an older generation of American Jews. They don't afford Israel quite the same significance as the older generation. It's less central in their Jewish identities. Caring about Israel is less important in their notion of what it means to be a Jew, and their emotional attachment is less. That's not to say they don't have emotional attachment. I mean, the most recent survey that I would point to that's really useful, the most comprehensive one when it comes to the Jewish American population, is the survey by the Pew Research Center. That was one done in 2013. There's another one that was done just last year. And what that showed is not that, there's no attachment to Israel, but something like roughly half of Jews under the age of 30 expressed an attachment to Israel, roughly half, compared to about 2/3 of Jews over that age. So there is a gap, there is a generational gap. And I think, so the question is, what's the cause for this gap? And will this gap persist over time? In terms of the cause, I think we often kind of conflate or confuse two things. One is a lack of attachment, engagement with Jewishness in general. And so for many, young Jews, their Jewish identity is just one of many identities that they have. It's not particularly a salient identity for them. They may be very disconnected with the Jewish community, lack of Jewish education. And so their attitude toward Israel is really a subset of their wider attitude towards Judaism and their Jewish identity, namely a kind of lack of interest and a feeling that it's really not relevant to them. So that's one group. And I think there the issue really is assimilation and the broader question of their Jewish identity. But there's another group who are often kind of lumped into the same group, which are Jews who actually have, young Jews who actually have a very strong Jewish identity and were raised in, Jewish day schools and synagogues and are really attached to their Jewishness, but also have a less strong commitment, let's say, to Israel and a much more critical attitude towards Israel than the older generation. And I think we sometimes kind of confuse these two issues, one of apathy toward Israel among young Jews, and the other of criticism of Israel, disaffection with Israeli policies. And those are actually two different issues, two different groups of young Jews were often lumped together. And I think they're both challenges, but I think driving them are very different things. And it's in some ways often easier for Jewish communal figures to focus on the issue of, the solution being Jewish education than focusing on the issue of criticism or disaffection with Israel, because that is a much more difficult conversation that can't just be addressed by, extolling the benefits of Jewish education.
It's interesting. There was, in that recent Pew survey you referred to, what I noticed is that the biggest shift is among those who are asked whether they have a strong emotional attachment to Israel. There's a big drop, but when you look at the numbers of people who have something of it, I think it's somewhat emotionally attached to Israel, the figures are still fairly high. Particularly, you're right, under 30, there's been a drop at like 30 to 40. the numbers aren't all that different. And I'm wondering if to what extent, of course, I think a majority of American Jews, and I know we're in Canada, and we talk about North America as kind of a euphemism for the United States, but it's what, you know, so much of the data is about the US. Yes, of course, they're still emotionally attached, but they don't have that fervor that may have characterized the younger generation. And I'm often asked about this, and my own sense is that you can't artificially create fervor, that every generation creates its own emotional connection with any cause. And so we can't go back in time and say, well, in 1970, you know, we all felt a certain way about Israel, so we can recreate it in 2021. And your point about apathy, then there's a follow-up question I want to ask about. Just this morning, David DeWitt sent around an article by a blogger named David Weinrib, who himself comes from, I suppose, a somewhat right-wing conservative perspective. And for him, this apathy that you're referring to is quite, you know, he sees it as quite noxious, quite deadly. And this is why, you know, the only answer to disaffection, say, from Israel is Jewish education. And he defines that largely in terms of Jewish observance. That is, and he's not promoting orthodoxy per se, but some kind of Jewish observance. And I'm wondering to what extent this actually is an idea in the Jewish community, that the way to make people better Zionists somehow is to have them light Shabbos candles, which strikes me as a rather odd set of priorities for Israel to be the ultimate goal and the Shabbos candles to be a means to an end. Right. And I was just wondering if you've come across this kind of way of thinking in your work on Jewish community activists.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think your insight is absolutely spot on. I mean, you know, for decades now, really, the hope has been that by encouraging an identification with Israel and a support for Israel and attachment to Israel, that would kind of trickle down into a broader engagement with Jewish life and Jewish identity. And so, you know, and historically, Zionism has served that function in the way of allowing Jews who are otherwise assimilating, who would otherwise maybe have, you know, completely lost touch with the Jewish community, to find another way of doing Jewish. I mean, in the past, of doing Jewish meant, you know, religious observance, ritual practice, communal engagement. Doing Jewish for the last few generations of secular Jews in the diaspora has often meant, you know, donating money to Israel, going there once a year. And so kind of performing a kind of performative embrace of Israel has been a way for many secular Jews to express their sense of Jewishness. The problem is it's been, I think, shallow for many. It hasn't actually, it's consisted of support for Israel, but it actually hasn't necessarily led to a wider engagement with Jewish life and education. So this idea that, you know, Israel could be, and this is something that I think even cultural Zionists believed, like Ahad Ha'am, you know, many years ago, that support for Jews in the diaspora who chose not to live in Israel, that their sense of Jewish identity would be bolstered and strengthened by the existence of Israel and by their attachment to Israel. And I think that's been true for a point, but it hasn't really led to a broader and a stronger and a deeper and a richer sense of Jewish identity for many. It's just kind of been this narrow identification with Israel. But I think, you know, there's now, as I say, so there's one question, which is how, you know, using support for Israel and attachment to Israel to strengthen Jewish identity. And obviously the most classic example of that has been birthright, right? I mean, the whole idea behind birthright was basically to get young Jews, you know, on these tours to Israel, and the hope that to some extent they would meet other young Jews and marry them and have Jewish babies. I mean, it was, you know, sometimes it was really about birth rate, not birthright. Right. And so certainly there has been that concern. I think the danger now in some cases is actually that disaffection from Israel and criticism of Israel and discomfort with Israel could actually lead some young Jews away from Judaism. So in having the opposite, instead of drawing them into Jewish communities and into Jewish life, and that has happened in the past. I mean, the survey data I mentioned before show that those young Jews who are less attached to Israel in their teens and 20s did become more attached over time and more involved in Jewish communities. Now it's not clear. In fact, it might be that for some, their protest over Israel, criticisms over Israel, is leading them to walk away from the Jewish community altogether. Is causing a kind of alienation from Jewish communal life. And so it's having the very opposite effect. Instead of what Zionists once hoped, that it would strengthen Jewish identification in the diaspora, it's actually, in some cases, weakening that identification because of its close relationship with support for Israel. So I think there are these shifts. I do think historically Israel and support for Israel has buttressed Jewish identity in the diaspora. I do think, whatever you think about Israeli government policies, whatever your attitudes toward the state of Israel, I think it's undeniable that for generations, Israel has allowed diaspora Jews a way of being Jewish that's been meaningful and that's brought them together. One of the things I write about in the book, Trouble in the Tribe, is that relationship is now shifted, and instead of Israel being this force that unified Jews in the diaspora and strengthened Jewish identity in the diaspora, there is a danger now that Israel is becoming a force that's polarizing Jews in the diaspora and is actually undermining or at least complicating their Jewish identities.
Exactly, and I'm wondering to what extent that might be actually the historic norm. That if you think when the Zionist movement began, it was hardly a majority movement. Lots of Jews opposed Zionism. Most Jews were indifferent or hostile to it. And then there was this brief moment after World War I where people were so excited about the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of a British mandate over Palestine. There was a huge amount of excitement, at least in the United States, and membership in Zionist organizations rose. And then it fell, and it was really quite low in the 1920s and 30s. And then in the 1940s, membership in Zionist organizations rose to over 1 million because of a very pragmatic concern about the fate of European Jews. And then in the 50s and 60s, I mean, it was okay to be a Zionist in the 50s and 60s, but you didn't have to subscribe to the notion that Israel was the actual, total center point of your Jewish life. And then after the 1967 war, not only because of the war, I think people emphasize the war too much, it's also because of the cultural movement in the United States of ethnic identity politics, Black power, feminism, Native American, Chicano identity movements. Jews became part of that fabric of identity politics. And then Israel became a way of asserting one's Jewish ethnicity. And that was really powerful for a few decades. But you mentioned this concern about young people drifting away from Israel ever since the 90s. That's 30 years ago. That's a long time ago. And I came across something, maybe you saw this, in the mid 90s, there was a gathering of major Jewish American sociologists about the future of American Jews. And one of them said, the problem is that Israel is now at peace. This was right after Oslo. So they were thinking, okay, Israel's not going to be, and how are we going to keep American Jews interested in Israel if they're no longer terrified that Israel's going to be destroyed? And one of the speakers said, well, Israel doesn't even need our money anymore because Israel is now a fairly stable country and economically prosperous. And so one philanthropist said, we should continue to give the money to Israel even if they burn it, because it's what we need to do to maintain our Jewish identity. So, but then, like you said, that sense of Israel being the center of our identity really began to fracture quite a while ago. So I'm wondering to what extent, maybe polarization is too strong a word, but divisions of opinion about Israel, to what extent that's actually the norm in the long term, and the notion of Israel as this force that unites all Jews is actually something of an aberration that we're familiar with from our own lives.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think there is a danger in looking back at a very, specific episode in Israel-diaspora relations, the decade after the Six-Day War, the decade after 1967, and holding that up as the model of what this relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel should be. And that decade and that very close identification and outpouring of support for Israel across the Jewish diaspora was, as you noted, a product of many developments, both in Israel, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in these diaspora Jewish communities themselves. And I think we shouldn't hold that up as somehow the expectation that the relationship that was forged during that decade of very close identification and unequivocal support for Israel, and the centrality of Israel in America, in diaspora Jewish life, in Jewish education and culture and politics, that should be what we should aspire to. And anything that moves away from that is a crisis and is a problem and is something that we need to kind of worry about and fret about. And I think actually, as you said, the norm historically is Jewish ideological and political pluralism, right? This idea of kind of that the pro-Israel consensus, as I would call it, that dominated diaspora Jewish life for about a decade or so. And it wasn't that long. I mean, the consensus begins to unravel really, certainly as early as the first Lebanon War, if not slightly before that with the election of the Likud. So it was a very brief period, but somehow there's this expectation that still reigns in some quarters that consensus must hold at all costs. And I think really we need to accept the fact that that was a kind of aberration in many ways, that period. And, we're entering a future in which there will be diverse and discordant Jewish opinions and attitudes toward Israel, and even more fundamentally, not just towards Israel's policies and politics, but towards the idea of Israel, towards Zionism itself. The embrace of Zionism among Jews in the diaspora happened for their own specific reasons at a specific historical period, particularly as a result of the Holocaust. And that it's kind of only natural then over time that some of the reasons that led to this kind of, I would say in a way, the hegemonic status of Zionism, the dominance of the fact that there was no ideological competitor across the Jewish world, that Zionism won this debate that had been raging in Jewish politics since the Haskalah, really, that Zionism, emerged as the last ideology standing in many ways. That is now changing. And now we're seeing, interest in Buddhism and, young people studying Yiddish. And that's not just about, attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's more broadly about attitudes towards Zionism and whether, support for, and whether Zionism should be the sine qua non for Jewish identity, and whether in fact there needs to be an allowance for multiple ways of being Jewish, some of which don't center the state of Israel or Zionism.
It's funny, as you were speaking, I was thinking of an adage that a traditional melody is the melody in synagogue that you grew up with. So for example, I was kind of crushed to find out that many of the liturgical hymns that I remember from my youth were written in the 1930s or something. And I thought, no, they've been around for centuries, millennia, right? They were on Mount Sinai. It's very hard for us to divorce ourselves from our own life experience and to historicize it and realize that there have been historically so many ways of being not just Jewish, but of being politically Jewish, right, and even of being a Jewish nationalist. There's more than one way to be a Jewish nationalist. So I think that's very true for the next generation. They're exploring different ways of being collectively Jewish. There is an issue, I think it affects older Jews more than younger ones, but I want to ask you about this, which is the issue about religious pluralism. The fact that the state of Israel is not kind to the non-Orthodox denominations, that it discriminates against conservative, reform, Reconstructionist Judaism in many ways, the whole controversy over the alternate prayer space in the Western Wall area, the southern edge of the Western Wall, the so-called Robinson's Arch, an ongoing controversy. And I know that in the world of the reform leadership or conservative leadership, there's a good deal of frustration expressed. How deep do you think irritation or frustration or anger it goes in the diaspora Jewish communities about Israel's stance towards the non-Orthodox communities?
I suspect that this is not as deeply held a concern or as widely shared a concern as you might imagine from the kind of announcements and plans and conferences and symposia and papers that come from Jewish communal organizations. I think for those Jews who are most affiliated with synagogues, with Jewish organizations, then Israel's treatment of non-Orthodox streams of Judaism is a real concern, and is experienced as a real slight, and is a major issue that in this major source of conflict in this relationship. But let's not forget that the vast majority of Jews, at least in the United States, and I probably imagine in Canada as well, I know in the UK, are not affiliated with synagogues. Most Jews don't belong to the organized Jewish community. They don't have much of an engagement. So I think for many, that Jews who are kind of the just Jews, or the nuns, as they might sometimes be referred to, and said they're not affiliated with any denomination or any, they could care less really whether there's a egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall. I mean, they're not really exposed to that issue in the same way as those who are most affiliated, most engaged are. And so I think it's not as widely held in that respect. And I also think for younger Jews, you mentioned, and I agree with you, that this isn't as much of a concern. I think there is, I think that partly stems from a sense that, for younger Jews who are confident in their Jewish identities, who really don't look to Israel to validate them. They don't really care a great deal. I mean, they think it's wrong that the Orthodox have this monopoly over Jewish life in Israel. But I don't think they're looking for a kind of stamp of approval from the Israeli rabbinate to confirm their understanding of Jewish identity. And I think that speaks to a broader shift where they just don't orientate themselves as Israel is the center of the Jewish world. Israel defines what it means to be a Jew, and Israel determines how Jews should be Jewish. I think for younger Jews, there is a kind of more almost anarchic attitude of like, well, we're going to do it ourselves in our own communities that reflect our own values. And we're not really interested in what either the Jewish establishment has to say or what the Israeli government has to say on that matter.
That's really fascinating, because I'm thinking of all my years teaching at the University of Toronto. I taught a lot of Jewish students, most of whom were engaged. And I don't, every now and then this issue would come up, of course, we would talk about it, but it did not exercise them, now that I'm thinking about it in retrospect, the way it would exercise, say, people of my generation. If we're sitting around the Shabbos dinner table talking about what's wrong with Israel, that issue would be quite prominent. And I think you'll find that Canadian Jews, and the panel who we'll be turning to in a few minutes, the Canadian Jews are, I think, a little bit more like Australian Jews than like UK Jews or American Jews. I believe that a substantial majority do affiliate, and there's much higher rates of day school attendance here than in, I'm in the United States now, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In Canada than in the United States. Donations to like the Friends of Hebrew University per capita are higher. And, Canada has always been kind of, the Jewish community is more tightly knit. And even though it's very small, it punches way above its weight. And it's much more adhesive. So I think what you're saying, it'll be interesting to see what the panelists who are Canadians say about that. I want to turn to sort of the elephant, the big elephant in the room. You've referred several times to the Israel-Palestine conflict and to a certain kind of tranche of young Jews who are not apathetic, but who are angry or frustrated. And they are, in fact, quite aware of what's going on, and it bothers them. And that can lead them to question their attachments to Israel. And that leads to a broader question of how diaspora Jews, so this would be largely, American Jews, or maybe about the UK, do they fundamentally differ from Israeli Jews on these basic questions about Palestinian claims to national rights, to statehood, two-state options, one-state options, all the various things that are out there? Is there a meeting of minds? Are the American, let's say American Jews, North American Jews, and Israeli Jews basically on the same page, or do you see differences?
I see growing differences in terms of attitudes towards the conflict. I think in an earlier era, Jews in the diaspora, at least Jews in the United States, took their lead from Israel and from Israeli Jews, and really, you know, saw Israeli Jews and Israeli leaders in particular as, you know, authoritative figures in terms of shaping their attitudes about the conflict. And so when Israeli leaders said, you know, we are sincerely trying to make peace, and it's the Arabs whose fault it is, and it's the Arabs who are refusing, you know, the vast majority of Jews in the diaspora accepted that as the accepted wisdom, didn't challenge that. And really, you know, their attitudes mirrored those of Jews in Israel. And I think that was true even, you know, through the 1990s during the Oslo peace process, where you had a majority of Israeli Jews, at least in the early years of the peace process, supporting the Oslo peace process, supporting negotiations with the PLO, and supporting, or at least really increasingly coming to support the idea of the establishment of a Palestinian state. Since the end of the Oslo peace process, the outbreak of the Second Intifada, I think gradually there's been a growing divergence of opinion between at least Jews in the United States, but I would say more broadly, and Jews in Israel. Jews in Israel have, broadly speaking, reacted to the outbreak of the Second Intifada and also the violence, Palestinian terrorism that unleashed, by essentially coming to the conclusion that they have no partner for peace. That is the dominant consensus in Israel among Israeli Jews. There is no Palestinian partner. That means there is no serious prospect for a two-state solution. There is no real point in trying to renew peace talks because they're bound to fail. And increasingly, an acceptance among Jews in Israel of the status quo. You know, however unequal it is, however problematic it is, particularly for Palestinians, that this is, you know, all that's available. And I think among Jewish Americans, those views are quite different. They believe that there is a Palestinian partner for the most part. I'm talking about the majority. There are, you know, significant minority of right-wing Jews who reject that view, but most American Jews continue to support the idea of the peace process, continue to believe that a two-state solution is possible, and continue to support the establishment of a Palestinian state, whereas most Israeli Jews today do not support the establishment of a Palestinian state. And so, you know, I think there is this divergence, and that's one source of tension. I think it's going to grow because what we see now is that America, it's Jews in the diaspora who are spending their time debating, should there be a one-state solution or a two-state solution or confederation? You know, the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only become a bigger and bigger issue among diaspora Jews, and a more increasingly divisive one. While ironically, it's become a smaller and smaller issue, less of a salient issue for Jews in Israel. They don't really think about it a great deal any longer. They're far more concerned about passing the budget, or, you know, domestic concerns, or what they see as domestic concerns. So it's interesting that, you know, it used to be said that Jews in Israel had this very raucous, intense debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where there was a wide spectrum of views, whereas Jews in the diaspora really didn't debate it much at all and just kind of took whatever the Israeli government line is. Now things are reversed. Now there is an increasingly open, public, and widening debate over the conflict among Jews in the diaspora, and I think a shrinking debate, very little debate, and very little difference of opinion among Jews in Israel.
That's fascinating. And I guess you see that Israeli consensus with the election returns, and you think about the percentage of Israeli Jews who vote for either right-wing or center-right parties. I mean, really pretty small percentage who vote otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a right-wing consensus among Israeli Jews, and that right-wing consensus, when it comes to attitudes toward the conflict, is manifested in the dominance of the right in Israeli elections time and time again. And whereas Jews in the diaspora are typically more liberal. So fundamentally, politically, these are two, I mean, I'm talking very broad terms, who have quite different political orientation, not just toward the conflict. I think the different attitudes toward the conflict actually stem from even deeper kind of philosophical, cultural divides between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel.
was it 3/4 or so of American Jews supported Biden, and about 3/4 of Israeli Jews would have supported Donald
Exactly.
Trump?
I mean, that just, that I think absolutely encapsulates the difference. I mean, for most American Jews, Trump was, the worst president. And not only in terms of his domestic policies, but they also criticized his policies towards Israel. They also actually were, they weren't supporting, much to Trump's dismay and displeasure and befuddlement. They didn't embrace him for, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, or for siding so strong. He believed that, he'd basically win the support politically and financially of American Jews by aligning his administration's policies so closely with Netanyahu government policies. That didn't happen. And that's because, while Israeli Jews loved that alignment and embraced Trump more so than almost any other population around the world, American Jews saw him, not as Cyrus the Great, but as kind of, a real threat to their own lives in the United States and to their values.
I wonder, how do we know what you claim? That is, I understand there are polls of voting behavior, but when I looked at the Pew survey, that the most recent one, they weren't asking. That survey didn't include questions on one state, two state, how you feel about the conflict, and so on. How do we know how American Jews differ from Israeli Jews on these questions?
Well, we do have some from the Pew survey, but yeah, they don't go into a great deal of detail. But they do ask, for example, one of the interesting things in the most recent one from last year is they did ask, for example, about US policy. Is the United States too supportive of Israel or not supportive of enough? And they also asked about things like attitudes towards the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and also about rating Netanyahu's performance. And in all of those areas, I think it was clear that American Jews were more critical of the Netanyahu government, of Netanyahu's policies, more critical of the Trump administration's policies, and less critical of the BDS movement than Jews in Israel. So that survey is, I mean, there's, when it comes to studying, although it's hard with such a small segment of the population, American Jews make up, just around 2.4%. So it's always hard to get reliable survey data because it's just hard to sample enough Jews. Nevertheless, probably of any diaspora group in the world, Jewish Jews and particularly American Jews are surveyed more often, more intensively. But I think, and you've written about this before, this survey data is useful to give us the raw figures, but it doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, if you see that there's so that's attachment to Israel, for example. It says many Jews are attached to Israel, most Jews are attached to Israel, but how do they express that attachment? What does it mean in behavioral terms? The survey data can't tell us any of that. And sometimes I think we obsess over these surveys and these statistics, and they in a way dominate the communal conversation too much. Whereas what we need to be looking at is much more kind of qualitative understanding of the meaning of what lies behind these statistics.
Right. We need to be anthropologists and not sociologists. I just want to ask a final question before turning things over to my colleagues and then to the floor. My last question is about red lines. That I understand that we're talking about a more diverse Jewish community in diaspora, at least in the United States. We're talking about a wide range of views or growing range of views about Israel. But where are the red lines now in terms of what is still acceptable within what we could call the organized Jewish community? A synagogue, a Jewish community center, a major Jewish philanthropy, and so on. I'm thinking of the petition or the statement in criticizing Israel's behavior during the May Gaza violence by 90 or 93 or something rabbinic students who were mostly at the liberal rabbinical seminaries. They were at Hebrew College in Boston, or at Hebrew Union College, JIR in New York City. You didn't have, I don't know if there were maybe a couple from JTS, but I don't
think. It was largely reform and
yeah. And to what extent, basically, and that struck me as an expression of feeling that at least some American Jews would say simply lies beyond the consensus, but I don't know. I don't know where the goalposts are being moved. So yeah, where do you see Where do you see the red lines now in this increasingly diverse public discussion about Israel?
Well, I think there's one of the battles in this larger kind of conflict over Israel that's taking place. One of the battles is where to draw these red lines and where should they be drawn, and do we even need red lines? Should there be some sort of demarcation between who's in and who's out, and who has the right to draw red lines? So, I mean, historically, the red lines have shifted. In the 70s, advocacy of a Palestinian state, support for a two-state solution, was a red line, and Jews could be essentially excommunicated for supporting the idea of negotiating with the PLO, or support for establishment of Palestinian state, positions that are now, very much consensus positions. So, the red lines have shifted a lot over the decades. I think today, the red line is not over, whether you support a Palestinian state, or even whether you're critical of Israeli government policies. The red line is whether you support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state or not. In other words, the very idea of political Zionism. And related to that, your attitude towards the boycott, divestment, sanctions with BDS. BDS has become the kind of litmus test, for inclusion of groups that Jewish organizations that promote BDS, like Jewish Voice for Peace, are defined as kind of outside, or at least there's an attempt to force them outside of the Jewish community. Whereas groups that might be very critical of Israeli government policies, but also critical of BDS, like say J Street, is inside. Not to everybody's mind, but I think BDS and increasingly support for the idea of Zionism, for the idea of Israel remaining a Jewish state, and that also relates to now like ideas like a one-state solution. So if you, as long as you embrace a two-state solution, you're inside. But if you now say, for example, a two-state solution is no longer possible, and the only solution is to enfranchise Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, equal rights for all, and essentially, a one-state solution, then I think that can put you outside the mainstream establishment, the Jewish community. But the broader debate, as I said, isn't just where to draw the lines, but even whether there should be lines and who are the gatekeepers, if you like. And I think for younger American Jews, it's not just that they reject these red lines, they don't accept the need for red lines, and certainly the right of kind of, typically older white men to tell them where those red lines are. And so I think that's part of the conflict that's playing out. Isn't just about what you can say or what positions you can take, but who has the right to define that, to determine that.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll just say that in 2 weeks, our discussion is going to be about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism within universities, and the issues of race, racial diversity, where Jews fit in the racial spectrum. These questions of who gets to set guidelines. Young people say, no, we're going to set our own, and rejecting the authority of, yes, older white men. So with that, thank you so much. And so, David, I'm going to turn it over to you to moderate do you moderate the discussion now with the panelists, or do I?
You're muted, David.
David, you're muted.
I am. Thank you. I have in the past, but I think this is going so well, Derek. If you don't mind, I think you should do so, because you're intimately involved in this conversation.
No, that's fine. What I'll do is I'll start with we've got plenty of time, so let's start with our own panel, then we'll open it up to people with questions from the audience. I think, John, you had your hand up first, and then Dylan, and then Howard.
Well, first of all, thank you to both of you. Terrific conversation, very important issues. I certainly agree with the analysis. I also agree with Derek in that I think the Canadian Jewish community is much more conservative in many ways and is much more like the Australian community, much more skeptical of the two-state solution and the Palestinian ability to get their act together. And, you know, everybody supports a two-state solution, but nobody thinks it's possible because of the security issue, et cetera, et cetera. I would only say, Derek, it's a small Jewish community compared to the United States, of course, and Israel, but we are, I think, the fourth largest after those two, or the third largest after those two. So it's 375,000 people, and as Derek said, very involved. But my question is, based on what you've said, you know, and you've hinted at this, we progressives in North America and elsewhere, we are the only ones actively pushing for a two-state solution. And sometimes I say to myself, I mean, this is ridiculous. What are we doing here in North America, expending all this energy, and really how much effect can we have? And yet, I was involved in a conversation with commanders for peace, who both a Palestinian and Israeli said the only way that Israel is going to change its policy is with international pressure. That it's not, I would say, would change with good leadership on both sides in Israel and the Palestinians. I don't necessarily agree with that, but maybe that's a pipe dream given the stats on the right-wing support in Israel. But what is your view? We do now have a group of Jews who support a two-state solution actively. That, you know, that's changed, but is that possible, or is change in Israel, change on the policy, only going to come from within? Do you have a take?
Yeah. So thanks. That's a great question. It's a challenging one to answer. So first of all, I do take the view that Jews in the diaspora can affect little, historically have had little impact on shaping Israel's policies. I mean, not just most obviously towards the Palestinians, but even on issues of direct concern to them, like religious pluralism. So I think, you know, diaspora Jews, unfortunately, haven't got a strong track record when it comes to being able to influence Israeli policies, for better or for worse, whether you think they should have a right to influence them or not. I think in many ways, you know, we in the diaspora should be probably, because we don't have, in my estimation, that much influence on Israeli government policies, I think we would probably be better off trying to ensure that some of the, what you might call the kind of blowback from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the spillover, doesn't affect Jews in the diaspora and their relationships with other communities. In other words, we can't solve the conflict over here, but we can at least try to prevent the conflict from affecting Jewish life in the diaspora and Jewish relations with other groups like Muslims and other groups in the diaspora. That, I think, should be the major focus of diaspora Jewish concern. But more broadly, you know, the question of how to resolve the conflict and the role that international pressure should play. On the one hand, I mean, I kind of fall somewhere in the middle of this debate, insofar as I think, you know, there's the one side says, you know, international pressure is bad. You need to support Israel and you need to embrace the Israeli government. And by embracing the Israeli government and making Israelis feel supported, that's more likely to induce them to be more conciliatory toward the Palestinians. And I think, you know, the track record doesn't support that thesis. What you see is simply that you know, there undoubtedly is a real cost that Israelis will pay for example, allowing establishment of a Palestinian state. There are costs that they will incur. There are real risks that Israelis face if a Palestinian state were to be established. And so you have to change the cost-benefit calculation for them. I mean, at the moment, the maintenance of the status quo, the maintenance of the occupation, now more than 5 decades old, is relatively low cost, right? And therefore, the situation is bearable, and they don't feel much pressure to change it. And That's not going to change. They're not going to put the pressure on their leaders to engage in peace talks or push for change in Israel's policies if they don't feel somehow that the situation becomes less bearable. I mean, this is basic to conflict resolution. You have to reach what conflict resolution experts call a mutually hurting stalemate, a situation where both sides are hurting the situation and therefore they want to change it. And right now, it's not mutually hurting. It's not to say it doesn't hurt Israeli Jews, but Palestinians suffer much more than Israeli Jews. Israeli Jews do not have a strong incentive to risk the establishment of a Palestinian state without more international pressure. So I think I disagree with those who say pressure is never good, shouldn't happen. But the idea that international pressure alone will somehow resolve the conflict, I think, is a flight of fancy. Based upon very little, because if you look at not just Israeli government response to pressure, but any government, look at how sanctions are rarely effective, right? Look at Iran. I mean, Iran is faced with sanctions over its nuclear program. It's not exactly showing a great willingness to many countries. External pressure alone does not, especially when their country's national interests or security interests are perceived to be at stake. What tends to happen in the face of that kind of international pressure is a kind of what political science call a rally around the flag effect. They come together, they reject this external pressure, and it actually plays to the benefit of more hardline domestic leaders who can use that international pressure to rally the public together and say, as Israelis have been told for decades, the whole world is against us. Mm-hmm. What you need then is a combination of smart pressure as well as a message that if you do A, B, and C, this pressure will end. The BDS movement, for example, which many people hold up as a form of pressure that might work, doesn't give Israelis that option. It basically says, it doesn't say if you withdraw from the West Bank, you'll be fine. And if you end the occupation, it says, well, no, that may not be enough. Ultimately, it's Israel's existence as a Jewish state. So I think that kind of form of pressure is not effective. It hasn't been effective, and I don't see it. And I think, yes, pressure, but it has to be smart, and it has to be much more narrowly focused on saying, change policy A, B, and C. And if you do, we'll embrace you, not just change your very identity.
E.g. settlements.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Dylan, I think you were next.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentation, Dov. It's been very interesting. So I have sort of a two-part question. One that goes away from the direction of Israel and Jewish identity. I was listening to a podcast the other day from something called Proof, called "Will the Jewish Deli Survive?" And I'll send you a link to it. It was very interesting, and it was talking about the dwindling of the deli in places like New York City from 2,000 delis in the 1930s to just a couple of dozen that exist today. In Toronto, we can probably count on one hand the number that exists. And a lot of what's driving it being that younger people are not showing up with their families the way that older people did. And I mean, if you go to United Bakers, which is familiar to most of the people on this call, the average age is not young, although it's still beloved to everybody in the community. So I just wonder how much of this phenomenon, especially in the United States, has to do with disconnecting from the traditional moorings of Judaism. And when that's applied to the issue of the conflict, I was part of a panel a couple of weeks ago at a conference with folks from a bunch of different communities, and somebody from the Black community got up and talked about the intense pressure. We were actually talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but she talked about the intense pressure not to air the community's dirty laundry from the Black community's perspective. This is very intense, that everybody needs to be on the same page and on the same message, and it needs to be focused externally, or else, everything's going to go sideways. So somebody from the Indigenous community in Canada got up and said, yeah, that's exactly the way it is for us. And it's very difficult. And there are all sorts of problems that we have internally. And whenever we're together and it's just us, we talk about all of our problems internally, but people feel a lot of pressure not to externally. And so, I think that's a lot of the tension in the diaspora community. And I just wonder if a lot of these younger members of the community who may like Israel and feel affinity towards it and like the idea of going there on vacation with their families, as the conflict and even the mention of the word Israel has become, a heated political fact. Anytime you talk about it in any context, if a lot of people just sort of disengage because they say, I don't want to be a part of the anger. And so I don't know your thoughts on that, but my suspicion is that that's a pretty palpable reason for a lot of folks' disengagement.
I completely agree. I mean, I see that most acutely on college campuses where for Jewish students on campus, where the issue of Israel-Palestine has become such a contentious one, and one of the most divisive, toxic issues in student life today, which is kind of bizarre to try to understand why a conflict thousands of miles away that really involves relatively few deaths and relatively is not a major conflict has become such a huge issue on campuses, college campuses, half a world away. But I think, I see it from many college Jewish students who just are wary of being there, whether it's even going into the Hillel, because they see that as becoming politicized. They're wary about taking Israel studies classes. Because this issue is seen as so toxic and it just turns off a lot of people. And I think absolutely, for a lot of people, the more toxic the Jewish discourse and public discourse about Israel becomes, one reaction is just to walk away from it and not want to. And I totally understand that inclination. I feel that myself sometimes. Just like, it is just vicious and nasty, and why do it? Why be engaged? Now, I have a strong connection to Israel and I can't walk away. But I can see why an 18, 19-year-old student who's deciding, well, do I want to get involved with Jewish life on campus and debates about Israel-Palestine, or do I want to get involved on, fighting climate change, right? And for many, I absolutely understand why, fighting climate change or any other issue is something that they'd rather be part of than be involved on this vicious conflict about Israel-Palestine. So I absolutely think that is a danger, and that's one of the reasons why in my book Traveling the Tribe and in my kind of public engagements, I've always argued for kind of toning down the discourse. I don't think the intra-Jewish conflict over Israel is going to go away. As Derek and I were saying, I think it's actually going to grow as Jewish life becomes more politically diverse. But I think it's essential to try to ensure that this conflict does not isn't as toxic as it is. We need to detoxify it. We need to be able to have a civil and open discussion without casting each other as enemies of the Jewish people and as traitors and as self-hating Jews. And, these kinds of things are a huge turnoff to many, not just young Jews, but, many people who just feel that it's, why would you want to be part of that?
Howard.
I too have two questions like Dylan, and they're related to the growing diversity between Israel and the diaspora. The first is a more direct one related to you said Zionism won at one point, particularly in 1967, you say in your articles, and I agree fully. I would now argue that the right has won in Israel, and your characterization of putting the conflict on the back burner is a sign of the right wing having won. That doesn't mean they mean to annex the whole of the West Bank, but it does mean that they're not going to give up on the settlements, the big settlements. And that relates to the second question that I want to ask is about comparative diaspora studies, because you can put the development of the Jewish diaspora in a comparative way. And we sort of know very simplistically that diaspora studies go through diasporas go through phases. One phase is the one you mentioned, is the mythical heroic phase where everybody celebrates Israel and becomes enamored by it. That happened conclusively by 67, but it took a long time for that victory to take place. But the second phase is the critical phase, where you take a critical attitude to it, and you begin to see these divergencies because you have different priorities and different perceptions. I think there's a third phase we're entering. The third phase is related to problem solving, because for diaspora Jews, for Israeli Jews, as you mentioned, the problems are different for them. For diaspora Jews, the problem may be that we dubs here on this panel don't accept that the right wing won. And therefore we keep harping on the two-state solution. We concentrate on different problems because we're bugged by the fact that we're, in a sense, losers when we were the dominant group in this area. I wonder if you could comment on that, two perspectives.
Yeah, in terms of, the right, it certainly looks that way at the moment, that the right has won in Israel, in politically and for a whole host of reasons, demographic, political developments in Israel, in shifts in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm not quite willing to completely write off the possibility of a shift. We've seen just in the formation of the current Bennett-Lapid government, strange things can happen in Israeli politics, right? We would never have, I wrote a book about Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Arab-Jewish conflict within Israel. And I would not have, that book came out a few years ago, and I would not have predicted the inclusion of an Islamist party, which is, related to the Muslim Brotherhood distantly, is a member of the Israeli government. So Israeli politics can produce strange bedfellows. It's dynamic, it's shifting. So I think we shouldn't just, write the obituary for the left in Israel and say, that's it, it's done. Israel is forever going to be increasingly right-wing. But I think certainly today, the right is dominant. And although there are slight signs that that might change, I think right now that is a lot of the frustration that liberal Jews in the diaspora feel, looking at Israel and see really no political hope for a shift in Israeli politics. I think the right isn't just winning in terms of, so I wouldn't say it's winning, but it could change. And I think the right is winning, though, at the moment, not just in terms of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, but also in terms of its understanding of Zionism. Increasingly, what Zionism means is defined by those on the right, which is a kind of a narrower understanding of Zionism, a Zionism that is grounded in Jewish particularism, ethnocentrism, and a kind of dismissive attitude toward, universal values, the international community, etc., and a kind of fatalism about Jewish history, like Jews are perpetually going to be, going to perpetually be outcast and perpetual victims of anti-Semitism, a very dark view. And I think that understanding of Zionism, there's always that strain of Zionism, but I think that strain of Zionism is ascendant. Today dominant, and that's very challenging, because going back to what Derek and I were talking about at the beginning about how Zionism has come to function as a way for so many Jews around the world to identify as Jewish. The challenge today is that what Zionism means is not the liberal Zionism that they were raised on. It's not the Zionism of a kind of, Israel as a liberal democracy, which also expresses Jewish values, but is one that is associated increasingly with Jewish supremacism, that Jews have more rights than others, that Jews certainly have more rights than Palestinians. And that then makes Zionism itself, Zionist ideology, something that younger Jews are less willing to identify with. and walk away from. So what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is just like a discomfort with Zionism, because the right is winning the century-long ideological debate over what Zionism is. It's not just that they're winning in Israeli politics. And I think it's important for Jews around the world in that respect to ask themselves, you know, is it possible to reclaim the meaning of Zionism? Can we continue to insist on a liberal Zionism or articulate a liberal Zionism when liberal Zionism is so weak in Israel itself? Can there be a liberal Zionism in the diaspora when Zionism in Israel is increasingly dominated by the right-wing political parties and right-wing ideological forces? I think that's a really big challenge. It's something I wrestle with myself, and I think many Jews will wrestle with and will continue to wrestle with as Israel seems to veer further and further to the right.
I'm going to call on Mark in a second, but I just want to draw the distinction then between younger people who walk away from Israel out of apathy, which is one thing we talked about earlier, or alienation. They're not happy with Israel. But the third thing that you mentioned earlier, to Dylan, that's really important, which is anxiety. I have run into that so often at Harvard. Students coming into my office and saying, you know, I just don't want to deal with the blowback of having to endure a political grilling every time I sign up for a student organization that fights climate change or for some other worthy cause. Mark, you're on.
Thank you very much. This has been very interesting. I wanted to see if there's a way that you could maybe unpack the whole issue of toxicity of the source of that. And there seems to be a number of different sources as to why there's such a toxic relationship or feeling. That one would be, you know, Israeli government policies, the settlements, for instance, as a source of real stress for Jews, liberal Jews, particularly young Jews that we're talking about, students on campus. There's, I guess, the question of, or the issue of anti-Israel activity on campus, which is, you know, in everybody's face if they go to a gathering in something like Very Hall at York University or something. So are there other sources of this toxic nature that you've been talking about, one? And two, what have you thought about, or has anybody been giving thought as to what could be done to sort of diminish this toxic nature that we see, the toxic environment? What kind of things would have to happen both in Israel and here in North America?
So it is something I've thought a lot about, because it is a great concern for me, and it is the one area where I think we can do something. You know, we can't really change Israeli policy. We can't, you know, force Israeli governments to withdraw from the West Bank, but I think we can have an impact upon trying to shift the tone and tenor of the Israel discussion, both among Jews themselves and in the wider context. In terms of what's contributing to this, there are, I think, you know, many factors. One, it's important to recognize, is the wider toxicity of our political discourse today, right? It's not just when it comes to Israel. I mean, you know, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Britain over Brexit, in Canada, there is a, you know, I think our political discourse in many liberal democracies is becoming increasingly polarized and increasingly toxic. And we all know that, you know, some of the familiar reasons for that. We're all in our kind of intellectual, ideological silos nowadays, you know, so we're not really accustomed to hearing or seriously engaging or listening to different views, because we get our opinions from, you know, social media or from news sources that we choose. The quality of political discussion is so low. It's really characterized by ad hominem attacks nowadays, not serious. So I think part of it is a broader problem with in political discourse in democracies around the world, and that's affecting how Jews discuss Israel as much as it's affecting, you know, conversations in other communities. Within the Jewish community, I think it's exacerbated this problem by the fact that there was once this norm that Jews did not criticize Israel in public and did not air their dirty linen in public, and that these were things, even if you disagreed with Israel, even if you had your criticisms, you kept that to yourself, you didn't make it in public. The fact that that norm has been eroded, and that now that certainly for younger generation, they're willing to very forthrightly and publicly express their criticism of Israel, that I think has added to it, because it's not just the criticisms that antagonize people, it's the mere willingness to do so publicly. It's the willingness to air that dirty laundry. And so what makes the argument so intense is that we're not just arguing about the specifics, we're arguing about the right to have an argument, the right to voice these opinions, the legitimacy of dissent itself. And I think that makes it all the worse. I think, in another reason, and this differs from one community to the next, because I studied this, you've all gathered, I'm originally from the UK. And, what I think across mainly diaspora Jewish communities, this development has occurred where Israel and the debate about Israel has become increasingly toxic and divisive. I think it's worse in the United States than it is in smaller Jewish communities. In smaller Jewish communities where there's more face-to-face contact, where you're less degrees of separation between Jews, it's harder to demonize your opponents. It's hard, you're more likely to encounter Jews with different opinions. There's smaller communities, there's a stronger desire for cohesion. Whereas the kind of distance, the fact that in the United States today, you don't really have a single Jewish community. You have different Jewish communities which rarely interact and have very, very different views about a host of things. And that really, so just as people talk about a red state America and blue state America, you kind of have that within the American Jewish community. And that kind of polarization intensifies the conflict, and smaller communities are less fragmented. There's a stronger desire for unity. There's a stronger sources of cohesion. And I think there's the less willingness to kind of demonize. What we can learn from this then is to shrink down the size of communities, that the more we can interact with people we disagree with and more we can sit across the table from them, the less we're likely to demonize them. The less we're likely to see them as, self-hating Jews or as fascists if they're on the right, or as traitors if they're on the left. So I think it is a question, the solution does lie within the Jewish, among Jewish communities, in bringing Jews together, and in really trying to foster open discussions, not defined by it has to be premised on you support Israel or you oppose BDS, but genuinely bringing in the full range of opinions to sit down. And I think, going back to the red line, the only red line for me in terms of who should be included in the conversation or excluded is whether you express a commitment to Jewish peoplehood and Jewish safety and security, fundamentally. There are very many different understandings about how best to ensure Jewish safety and security and what's best for Jewish peoplehood. But as long as you kind of share that basic value, then I think you should have a seat at the table. And I think we need to be much more inclusive in that respect and much more willing to hear really challenging viewpoints and analyses, not because we will necessarily agree with them, but because then it becomes harder to demonize the people who hold those views, because we understand that actually maybe they're not so different from us, and maybe they also care about Jewish life and security. They just have a different understanding of how best to ensure that.
Thank you.
Very wise point. And last and certainly not least, David. Oh, you are muted.
My apologies. Thank you. It's really been a superb discussion. I'm a lapsed student of international politics. The last few times I taught a course in Middle East politics before I retired, there were no Jewish students. I had lots of students from across the Middle East, a few from Europe, and some Canadians. There were no Middle East students. There were no Jewish students. And it was a curious situation. And the course was actually listed also with the Center for Jewish Studies. And they still, Jewish students would not go into a course on the politics of the Middle East. It was that kind of anxiety. So it's just a comment on the earlier exchange you had with Derek. I wanted to ask a different question than so far has been entertained. You mentioned briefly settler colonial language. I'd say that I think it's a fair observation that the politicization of Zionism as equivalent to settler colonial language and the overall presence of identity politics and ideology, both in education and in some media, has really taken hold of the way Israel is contextualized, where it's placed among students. I see it among faculty, and I see it social media and even mainstream media. There is a reference to the settler colonial world. And it's almost a sense of we in the privileged position of being in North America are looking for a way to expunge our own settler colonial presence, being in North America. But we're also sitting, in terms of the Jewish diaspora, we live in this very privileged environment of a liberal democratic society. And I guess that part of the argument of the place of the Jewish diaspora is now we're in a position of strength. And that creates a different kind of dynamism and expectation. And as you made very clear in your earlier comment stuff, there is this tension and it's definitely in the younger generation, but I think it was in my own as well. As we were maybe the children of Holocaust survivors, or at least we were close to that Holocaust experience. We knew a little bit of history, and suddenly we found ourselves in the privileged environment of democracy and the importance of a liberal democratic environment and the separation of church and state. And so that was conflicting with the rise of the Israeli state. And so now that's just kind of a background. I really want to turn to this issue of the Abraham Accords and normalization, because we haven't talked about that yet. We will in following sessions. I'm just wondering if you have some sense that this so-called normalization within the region, for Israel having doors opening up to it with Arab states, if that is seen as Israel on the road towards not just regional acceptance, but international acceptance. And if that's so, does that play to the strength of self-serving nationalism and the centrality of political sovereignty, and therefore the legitimacy of Israel? In this, on the one hand, I'm sitting here as a lapsed political scientist. John used the term progressive, someone else used the term a dove, believing in a two-state solution, which is inherently pro-national and pro-state sovereignty, which seems to be running against the stream of where students in universities are in North America, that are looking at identity politics and yet don't see that identity politics actually clashes with globalization. So it seems to me that we're in in a cauldron of competing and contextually confusing ideas and symbols and language. And yet, if, as an international relations person, I look at the opportunities that the Abraham Accords spreading into really a more normalized interstate relationship, we're strengthening states, we're strengthening sovereignty, we're strengthening national identity. Might that not open up an opportunity for a two-state solution that could be acceptable to progressives? Because I think of what the alternatives are, and I don't see identity politics fitting in very well with a one-state solution, because it denies the identity of a particular national movement.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think, I think the normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan are all to be welcomed. They're all certainly positive developments. And I think in many ways, are an indication, another indication that the Arab-Israeli conflict, the conflict between Israel and Arab states surrounding it is, effectively over. I mean, it's really been over for decades. I mean, Syria is really the only state that really actively maintains, Arab state that actively maintains a hostile posture towards Israel, and like Lebanon to a lesser extent. I think so. Yeah. What the Abraham Accords underscore is that for some time now, really, there's been a shift in attitudes among Arab leaders and Arab states towards Israel, what growing willingness to cooperate with Israel, first of all, covertly, now overtly, and a recognition that they share common interests. And that's all good. And it's really an important milestone for Israel's integration and acceptance in the Middle East, and it's to be welcomed. But I think the claim that somehow this will then bolster the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace and the resolution of the conflict, or pave the way to a two-state solution, is divorced from reality. For one thing, in many ways, the motivation on the part of the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time, to solidify these agreements was in fact not to see them as a stepping stone to a two-state solution, but to see it as an alternative to one, to say, look, we don't need a two-state solution. We don't need to establish a Palestinian state to have good relations with the Arab world, and so basically you on the left, you're always warning about Israel's diplomatic isolation, regional isolation, always arguing that, solving the Palestinian issue is the key to Israel's embrace in the region. You're wrong. And so the argument that's been put forward to Israeli Jews is not, this should now encourage you to be more conciliatory to the Palestinians, to see that actually, Israel's place in the region is not under siege. But in fact, this shows that we don't really need to worry about the Palestinian issue, and we can put it on hold because we can get all the economic and diplomatic benefits we want with the Arab world and with many other states around the world without resolving the Palestinian issue. Not to mention the fact that it gives Palestinians themselves less leverage in any future negotiations with Israel. So I really don't see the Abraham Accords as a kind of prelude to Israeli-Palestinian peace, or even a renewal of serious peace talks. On the contrary, and I think they're a good thing. But I think they're a good thing in terms of Israel's relationship with Arab states and Israel's economic interests and its strategic interests, but not in terms of how it's going to impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is, I'm also an international relations scholar, but really this is becoming an internal. This isn't like the external interstate conflict. This is a conflict which started as an intercommunal conflict between two communities living in one polity, British Mandate Palestine, and is increasingly now an intercommunal conflict between two communities living in one polity, namely under Israel's direct or indirect control. So it's becoming, in many ways, not this external conflict between a state, but a conflict between two groups of people living under Israeli sovereignty, effectively. And that's how it's being seen now. So in many ways, we might look at it as, well, in conflict between interstate conflicts are solved by negotiations, they're solved by territorial concessions and compromises, and, traditional conflict resolution techniques. But if you start seeing this now as not a conflict between kind of like an interstate conflict, but a conflict between a majority and a minority, or between two groups that are roughly equal in size, Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and Jews in this entire area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, then it becomes a struggle between different ethnic groups, right? And in that respect, it is seen by Americans as not dissimilar from what's happening here. In other words, just as it's seen as, while white Americans are fearing the loss of their demographic majority, fearing the loss of their privileges, fearing the loss of their power and status in American society, challenged by the demographic rise of, other groups, and this kind of shift in cultural and maybe even eventually political power, that's taking place in the United States. And people, and I think wrongly and simplistically, put the same frame of what's happening in Israel. You have another group, it's not in terms of race, but you have a group of Jews who have historically exercised domination over Palestinians. And now that domination and the ways in which that's maintained is being challenged. In other words, in both contexts, there's a civil rights struggle, a such struggle for true equality. Now, I think that that analogy is too simplistic. It glosses over lots of differences between these situations, but actually, as things shift and as the belief and a hope for a two-state solution diminishes, and it becomes increasingly seen as a conflict between two groups within one effective state, within a one-state reality, the ways in which this conflict is seen becomes increasingly similar to the ways in which issues in the United States or in Canada between indigenous Canadians. I mean, if we start having the same, and people applying the same language, and not seeing it as something that can be solved by a peace agreement, but something that actually can only be solved by, what some would argue is a kind of internal decolonization or reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, justice, racial justice, etc. Very different discourse, one that Jews are very uncomfortable with, because we've seen this as a conflict between two sides, not as a kind of oppressive, one group oppressing another. But that is how the conflict is increasingly being seen. And I think that will continue to be the case as the reality of what is today a one-state reality, the reality that there is one effective state in this area, and there are and that one group of people living within that, Palestinians, have lesser rights in that situation, is increasingly being acknowledged. However complicated the reasons for this one-state reality, and I don't think Israel's solely to blame for it, that reality, I think, is becoming increasingly recognized, and it's in many ways creating this, fueling a lot of the anxiety and discomfort that we've been talking about this morning.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I know it's 1:30 and that we need to stop. I just want to bring your comments, these really enlightening comments, back directly to the issue of Israel and diaspora, because I think that for people of a certain age who have direct memory of Israel and the Oslo years, and the recognition of Israel by Jordan and by India and China and the Vatican, and the restoration of ties with African states. I mean, there was this heady rush of recognition, which has an existential and psychological and emotional value, as well as a diplomatic one. And I think even more so for people of my age or older who have very clear memories of the peace with Egypt. The normalization agreements, the so-called Abraham Accords, have much more emotional power to people of those generations than to younger people, because the notion that the mere act of recognition will somehow cement Israel's place in the world and will somehow either make the Palestinian problem disappear or will make it more amenable to solution. I think this is really fundamentally an emotional reaction, and it comes from, again, Jews of a certain age. My students in my courses on Israel none of them really think that the Abraham Accords can have much of a direct effect on the Israel-Palestine situation, no matter how you define it. So again, generational issues that we've touched on so much this morning, this afternoon, are very important. So Dov, thank you. This was marvelous. And David, I'll leave it to you to say the last word.
Thank you. If Rabbi Goodman is on the line, I'll call upon him. But again, let me add my thanks, and on behalf of our little organizing group, this has been a superb hour and a half. It is recorded, and we encourage folks to tell their friends and family that they should really link into the recording if they miss this opportunity. There's a lot to think about, and with your understanding, it's likely that whether it's in a few months or longer down the road, we will be coming back to you. Thank you so much. And Rabbi Goodman, over to you.
So I have very little else to say. I'd hate to take the last word of this really, as you said, superb conversation. So thank you to each of you for your time, for your expertise. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We'll see you same time, same place next week. And Professor Waxman, thank you again for joining us. And I do think we're going to be hearing from you in the Holy Blossom community, but also Big Adult. I'll be sending some articles that you've written, as well as an interesting article that's making its way about, of which I sent prior to the session, but all worth reading. So thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Take care.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Shalom, everybody.
Derek, thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Derek.
Good to see you.
Nice to see
Thank
you
you,
all.
Dov.
To meet you on screen, Dov.
Likewise. Hopefully next time in person.
That will be perfect.
Inshallah.
All right.
Inshallah.
Shalom.
Bye.
Bye.